Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. As soon as that battleship became visible within the black mists, Bai Xiaochun's vision ended. Having regaining lucidity, he found himself in front of the sovereign's head, being shoved away by the immense pressure. This time, he fared much better than on the previous occasion. He had acquired an additional 20% of the qi flow, which was already entering his body. Bai Xiaochun didn't ask any questions, but his eyes shone brightly. He knew what was happening. Bai Xiaochun returned to the fan and rested for a few days, then headed back toward the sovereign's head, his eyes shining with determination. As his hand touched the skin, and he unleashed his Taoist magics, the blankness once again took over. By now, he was used to it, and simply let it happen. Time passed, after which, he woke up. Or perhaps it was Zhou Chen who woke up. This was his third vision of the sovereign's memories. Much time had passed since the events of the second. Although Zhou Chen still looked middle-aged, he was now more dignified. He hovered in the starry sky, a beautiful woman at his side, who was none other than his Taoist partner, his immortal imperatrix. Arrayed behind them was an army of millions upon millions of cultivators. Facing them was a black cloud mass filled with devilish specters. Not an ounce of life force was present there, nor could any life force be detected on the black-robed man who stood in front of the clouds, who was none other than Zhou Fan. His black robe itself seemed capable of consuming everything in its path, it even caused the light in the area to bend toward him. The black hair which swirled around him did nothing to hide the icy coldness of his eyes as he stared at the leader of the army from the immortal world, Zhou Chen, as well as the woman at his side. Mixed emotions could be seen in Zhou Fan's eyes as he looked at her, but soon they vanished, and he focused his attention on Zhou Chen. Zhou Chen, or rather, I suppose I should call you, the worldly Taoist. 1. As Bai Xiaochun hovered there, he couldn't prevent the rage and anger from rising up in his heart, as well as the grief. He thought back to how, after his brother entered the Valley of the Black Clouds, everything went back to normal. Zhou Chen eventually chose to rise to the middle three heavens, and after several years, became a celestial. Then something happened that was relatively rare. He ascended to the higher three heavens, where he became the apprentice of the then reigning immortal imperator. At that point, he was given a Taoist name. No longer would he be Zhou Chen, he would be the worldly Taoist. That was when he met an elder brother called the mortal Taoist who reminded him a lot of his own older brother. They got along well, and soon became Archaeans together. Both of them fell in love with their junior sister, who happened to be the daughter of the immortal imperator. Eventually, their master, the original immortal imperator, faded away, becoming a part of the starry sky's essence of time, a portion of the river of time and space itself. Years later, the worldly Taoist gained the approval of the immortal world, and became a sovereign. He was named the new immortal imperator, and his junior sister chose to marry him, becoming his immortal imperatrix. Unfortunately, the mortal Taoist, whose cultivation base was actually slightly higher than the worldly Taoist's, was frustrated over and over in his attempts to achieve a breakthrough, and could not gain the approval of the immortal world. It was a matter of public note, and many people had speculations about the situation. And that was when, down in the lower three heavens, outside the Valley of the Black Clouds, Zhou Fan appeared, clad in a black robe. He was not alone. Countless devilish specters emerged from the clouds with him, and once again, war visited the immortal world. However, that was not the most shocking development. When Zhou Fan and mortal Taoist met, the two of them merged into one. At that point, everyone knew that mortal Taoist, apprentice of the original immortal imperator, was actually the clone of Zhou Fan, who had disappeared into the lower three heavens years ago. Somehow, after the clone and the true self merged back together, despite the fact that the will of the immortal world refused to offer approval, he broke through to become a sovereign. At that point, he discarded his true surname of Zhou. He also abandoned the Taoist part of his earlier Taoist name. He kept the Fan character, which meant mortal, and then added the character renegade to it. He was rebelling against that which was orthodox, defying the heavens to change his fate. As of that moment, the immortal world gained the mortal renegade, devil imperator. For a sovereign to exist without the approval of the immortal world was heresy, but there was nothing that could be done about it. As soon as the mortal renegade became a sovereign, he led his army of devilish specters to wage war on the immortal world. After much bitter fighting, the two brothers were finally reunited at this moment. Mortal renegade, you're a sovereign now, so why stay in the immortal world? Back outside the valley of extermination in the lower three heavens, all I asked was that you come back to me. I would have done anything. Now, all I ask is that you go. Leave the immortal world, and never come back. The worldly Taoist hid the pain in his eyes as he looked at the stranger that was his brother. Up to this point, he still didn't understand why all of this was happening. Meanwhile, the mortal renegade hovered in the starry sky, hands clasped behind his back as he looked at the worldly Taoist, a faint smile on his face. You know, worldly Taoist, there is a legend in this starry sky. If this universe were to be bereft of all life force, all living beings, all worlds, and all peoples, if the starry sky went dark, then in the black void that resulted, an eternal flower would bloom. The eternal flower will only bloom when a vast collection of worlds vanish. Only one flower. Consume that flower, and you can break out of the sovereign realm and become truly eternal. That is the only way to become eternal. There is no other path. There was a bizarre power within mortal renegade's voice that caused everyone who heard him speak to feel deeply shaken. So yes, I'll leave. But I'll only do so after wiping out the immortal world. Then I'll go to the next world, and the next group of people. Eventually, I will extinguish all of the starry sky, at which point, the eternal flower will bloom for me. The vision ended, but Bai Xiaochun did not awaken. He sank into blankness again, and when he opened his eyes again, he saw the last memories that existed in the sovereign's head. As they poured in, he trembled, and felt himself filling up with rage, and even more so, grief. He was there in the starry sky, hair disheveled, weak, and injured. His life was about to sputter out as he looked down at the crumbling immortal world, where countless devilish specters were slaughtering cultivators left and right. Obviously, the immortal world was no match for this opponent. The countless spheres which surrounded the immortal world were shattering. In his arms was the corpse of a woman. She was his immortal imperatrix, but her aura had been exterminated. There, in her forehead, was a black spike, slowly emanating black smoke. That spike had destroyed her life force, and despite being a sovereign who had mastered the essence of life and death, the worldly Taoist was not capable of resurrecting her. He could only hold her body, tears streaming down his face as he threw his head back and howled, "Mortal renegade." The worldly Taoist stared at the black-robed figure in front of him, whose mere presence, as well as the vile black smoke that swirled around him, caused everything to twist and distort. Although his life had reached the end, and the flame of his life force was about to go out, the worldly Taoist still had the energy to shout, "Why? Why did you do all of this? Shan Shan is my Taoist partner, and your junior sister. She's our master's only flesh and blood. How could you be so cruel? Don't tell me it's for that eternal flower. That's just a legend. And even if it's true, it doesn't explain why you've changed." Mortal renegade. Zhou Fan. Brother, tell me, what happened to you? The mortal renegade didn't seem to be affected at all by the worldly Taoist's shout. He simply looked back at him calmly, almost as if he were already dead. Apparently, he really had severed any and all emotions connected to him. It was only after the worldly Taoist's voice faded away that he finally spoke. There are two people in my heart, two people who have hindered my pursuit of the great Tao. The first is the woman that both of us fell in love with. The other is you. This was the first time that mortal renegade had actually acknowledged the relationship between himself and the worldly Taoist. In response, the worldly Taoist shivered. However, he knew his brother and therefore chuckled bitterly and said, "I understand. You killed junior sister, and now you'll kill me. Afterward, nothing will hinder your pursuit of your Tao." Mortal renegade looked back at the worldly Taoist, who was now so weak he couldn't fight back no matter how much he wanted to, and then nodded. "After I kill you," he said, "I'll eradicate the immortal world. Then, I will have no hindrances. As for whether or not the eternal flower is a mere myth, well, there's only one way to find out for sure. Even if it's not real, all of this still conforms to my Tao." Not giving the worldly Taoist a chance to respond, he waved his hand, his eyes flickering coldly as the starry sky around him distorted. Apparently, a natural law was at play, causing an invisible, invincible blade to appear. The blade flashed, and the worldly Taoist's head flew off of his body along with a spray of blood. Shockingly, the blade was so enormous that the worldly Taoist's fleshly body, as well as the body of his wife, were shredded into nothing but drifting ash. Only his head remained, and in the final moment before he actually died, he managed to say one more thing. "Master once told me that if there really is an eternal flower, then after it absorbed all of the desolation and death of this starry sky, it would definitely form its own spirit. You are doomed to lose, mortal renegade." The mortal renegade's expression remained the same as ever. He closed his eyes, and as he did, his aura began to grow stronger. The spheres of the immortal world had crumbled, and the 9 heavens that made up the landmass had fallen into ruin. All living beings had been exterminated, leaving behind only devilish specters. The mortal renegade's aura reached an indescribable level, whereupon he opened his eyes, turned, and led his massive army on a rampage to exterminate everything. That was where the vision ended. Bai Xiaochun's eyes opened, and the last of the chi flow flowed into him. At the same time, the worldly Taoist's head crumbled into ashes and drifted out into the surrounding ruins. As of this day, he finally got his dying wish, to be buried along with the immortal world. Bai Xiaochun stood there, quietly watching the ashes drift away, his mind alive with the memories of the worldly Taoist, immortal imperator. Now he knew the truth about the eternal immortal domains, also known as the eternal flower, as well as the enormous giant who was sealed outside of them. The mortal renegade, he murmured. He knew much now, but there was also a lot of missing information. However, he was 80% confident that his speculations and analysis of those aspects were correct. The mortal renegade had killed his younger brother and the woman they both loved. He had wiped out the immortal world, and then led his army of devilish specters on a path of extermination and destruction. In the end, he killed all of the people in the starry sky, and destroyed all of the worlds that existed within it. Just as he had said, he cast the starry sky into complete darkness. And then, just as had been spoken of in the legends, the desolation and death caused the eternal flower to bloom. According to such legends, the only way for a cultivator to break out of the sovereign realm was to use that eternal flower, and reach the eternal realm. The mortal renegade came very, very close to succeeding. He cast the starry sky into darkness, and destroyed everything that existed. The desolation he brought proved the legends true. He personally witnessed the eternal flower bloom. Just outside of the eternal immortal domains, the mortal renegade reached out to grab the eternal flower, which he would destroy, absorb, and then use to become eternal. However, something unexpected happened. That was when, just as the worldly Taoist had said, the eternal spirit came to be. Bai Xiaochun thought back to the stories of the eternal mother and the three eternal sons. And he thought back to how the eternal mother had spoken to him when he became a celestial. I bet I can guess what happened. When the mortal renegade reached out for the flower, the eternal spirit, another term for the eternal mother, was not willing to be destroyed and absorbed. She formed three incarnations, three expressions of her divine sense. They became the Arch-Lord, Saint-Lord, and Vile-Lord. They were the three eternal sons. The three eternal sons fought with the mortal renegade, backed by the power of the eternal mother. In the end, they paid a bitter price to temporarily resolve the crisis and seal their enemy. However, there is one question that remains unanswered. Where did the inhabitants of the eternal immortal domains come from? He closed his eyes in thought for some time before coming up with an answer. In order to resolve the impending crisis which would inevitably come, the eternal mother turned her three eternal sons into statues, and then used her divine sense to create worlds inside of them, filled with countless living beings. Her hope was that, years later, when the mortal renegade finally broke free, one of her people would be able to reach the eternal realm, and stave off complete calamity. That was the only thing she could do. Bai Xiaochun couldn't be sure how much of his speculation was accurate. But based on the clues he had so far, they seemed highly likely to be true. After a moment of silence, he sighed. Looking out at the ruins of the immortal world, and the scattered ashes of the worldly Taoist, immortal imperator, he clasped hands and bowed deeply. Then he returned to his treasured fan. Bai Xiaochi seemed about to say something, but held back, and simply stared at the departing ashes, his eyes flickering with grief. Bai Xiaochun looked over at him, then quietly said, "I'll tell you whatever you want to know about the immortal imperator's memories." Bai Xiaochi shook his head. "There's no need. It's all in the past now." Bai Xiaochun nodded, then sat down cross-legged to examine the chi flow of the immortal world that now existed within him. Taking a deep breath, he rotated his cultivation base and began his attempt to break through to the Archaean realm. Considering there were no living sovereigns, the Archaean realm was the absolute highest level a cultivator could reach at the moment. However, it was very difficult to do so, a fact made clear considering that there were only two Archaeans in the eternal immortal domains. All celestials dreamed of succeeding, and yet, none could. In the past, Bai Xiaochun had not understood, but now he did. To become an Archaean, one not only had to be sufficiently powerful, one also had to acquire the approval of the world. Without that approval, any attempts at a breakthrough would fail. As for why there was no third Archaean in the eternal immortal domains, Bai Xiaochun already had his speculations. The method of giving approval is by distributing a portion of power of the world, in other words, its chi flow. But the eternal mother is too weak now, like a candle flickering in the wind. She simply can't sustain the existence of three Archaeans. She can only sustain 2. Eyes flickering, he continued to rotate his cultivation base, and sent the chi flow of the immortal world circulating through his body. As he did, the signs of an imminent breakthrough became clear. After all, he was now in the immortal world, a place that had once been home to the most powerful group of people in all of the starry sky. Even though that world had been reduced to ruins, the remaining chi flow was enough to propel one person into the Archaean realm. When a celestial became an Archaean, his or her Daoseed would bloom, sending roots out into every corner of the body, and producing a flower of Tao will. When the Daoseed disappeared, that was the moment of becoming an Archaean expert. With boundless Tao will, all it took was a thought to unleash divine abilities and magical techniques. Although Tao will did not make one eternally indestructible, nor did it grant eternal life, to some extent it was like transcending, becoming a truly supernatural entity. For example, a mere look from the vile emperor could cause ordinary celestials to tremble in their boots. And all the Saint Emperor had to do was unleash a bit of pressure, and wild colors would flash in heaven and earth. Were it not for Bai Xiaochun's shockingly powerful fleshly body, and its union with his cultivation base, as well as his Archaean luminescence, he would never have had the requisite battle prowess to fight Archaeans. The reason why Archaeans could resurrect fallen celestials who served them also had to do with Tao will. Upon receiving the portion of a celestial's Daoseed, the Archaean would use Tao will to brand it with an undying mark. If the celestial died, the Archaean could then use Tao will to activate the innate regenerative capabilities that existed within Daoseeds, but were beyond the control of celestials. Then, the Daoseed could form a new soul and body. The abilities of Archaeans to do such things were why imperial dynasties could stand the test of time. As Bai Xiaochun sat there cross-legged, his Daoseed shone with dazzling light. It had already been years since the seed sent roots throughout his whole body, but it had never been able to bloom into a flower of Tao will. Now that he had the chi flow of the immortal world, the resulting reaction was akin to throwing some cold water into a vat of boiling oil. Rumbling sounds filled him as all of the roots the Daoseed had sent out began to shine brightly. If anyone could have seen him at that point, it would look like he was filled with innumerable, brightly shining veins. At the same time, his aura was rising higher and higher. The ruins of the immortal world began to tremble, and countless motes of dust began to rise up, and then slowly drift toward Bai Xiaochun. As they swirled around him like a vortex, the sensation of a breakthrough grew even more intense. At the same time, the void vibrated, and more dust swirled in his direction. Soon, he was surrounded by a vortex fully 300,000 meters from end to end, completely shocking and majestic in appearance. Boundless light shone up from him as he sat there on the treasured fan. Off to the side, Bai Xiaoqi knew that he had reached a critical juncture, and immediately sent out some divine sense as he stood as a Dharma protector. Time passed. The light grew more intense, and the screaming vortex grew to a size of 3 million meters, and even bigger. That vortex seemed to contain power to shake all of the void, and that power was only growing stronger. Time seemed to slow. When Celestials became Archaeans, each one was different. Some could succeed quickly, others took time, the primary factors being one's level of strength and the approval of the world. Bai Xiaochun was already far beyond the celestial realm in terms of strength, and had the approval of the immortal world in the form of some of its chi flow. Therefore, the process went relatively quickly for him. In fact, Bai Xiaochun's level within the celestial realm could only be described as heaven-defying. That much was evident from the vortex around him, which was a manifestation of the battle prowess of his cultivation base. As the vortex spun with utter madness, it soon reached a size of 9 million meters. And it didn't stop there. Next was 15 million meters. Not only was the size itself shocking, so was its speed of expansion. In the end, it reached 30 million meters, where it finally seemed to find an equilibrium. Because there was no other person to compare to, it was impossible to truly see how shocking that was. For example, back in the eternal immortal domains, vortexes greater than a few hundreds of thousands of meters had never been seen. Even in the days of the immortal world, it would be extremely rare. The worldly Taoist, immortal imperator, had a vortex of 21 million meters. And the only person who could rival Bai Xiaochun was the heaven-defying mortal renegade, devil imperator. Time passed. The vortex lasted for 3 years, shaking all of the ruins of the immortal world, even locations very far away. During the entire time, Bai Xiaochun wasn't affected at all by the screaming winds. And he shone so brightly that it wasn't possible to even make out his body. He was like the only shining star in the void. Then, a voice spoke out into the ruins of the immortal world, a voice that rumbled like thunder, but at the same time, was little more than a murmur. The Archaean realm. The 30 million-meter vortex exploded with intensity, screaming and howling in a way that shook even the most remote areas of the immortal world, until all of it was affected. It was a monumental and shocking scene. The void itself trembled as the vortex which covered the immortal world gradually took the shape of a flower, blooming right there within the void. It was illusory, but clearly visible. Next, all of the rubble and dust that existed in the immortal world began to vibrate as the illusory image shrank down, rapidly forming into a corporeal flower. For the first time in 3 years, the treasured fan finally became visible there in the middle of the immortal world, along with the flower. That was Bai Xiaochun's Tao will. If any person could have been there to observe what was happening, they would have been profoundly shocked. The flower continued to shrink for the time it takes an incense stick to burn. Then, Bai Xiaochun took a deep breath, and the flower collapsed into strands of mist that entered his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. Cracking sounds echoed out as his hair grew longer, and his skin more fair, leaving him looking even younger than he had before. He was almost like a teenager now, and yet, when he opened his eyes, they were profoundly abstruse. The Archaean realm, he whispered again. He had assumed that some sort of tribulation would come, and it would have if he had been in the eternal immortal domains. But now he realized that, because he was in the immortal world, and had absorbed the last of its chi flow, he had become something like its protector, and therefore, no tribulation came. He slowly rose to his feet, his aura causing the void to distort around him. Off to the side, Bai Xiaochun shivered. Looking at Bai Xiaochun, and his surging energy, Bai Xiaochun almost felt like he was looking at his previous master. As Bai Xiaochun stood there, his hair long, his skin fair, he looked almost the same as he had back when he first joined the Spirit Stream sect. But his aura would cause any cultivator who was not an Archaean to tremble. Even other Archaeans would be able to tell that, although he looked slim and fair, a terrifying power pulsed inside of him. It wasn't fleshly body power, it was cultivation base power. He was now filled with countless strands of Tao will, and as for his sea of consciousness, it no longer contained a Dao seed, but rather, a flower of Tao will. The changes to his cultivation base felt strange. However, he could already tell that his fleshly body had now fallen behind the power of his cultivation base. The next thing I need to do is figure out how to get an Archaean-level fleshly body. It was only at this point that a certain level of excitement appeared in his heart, which was actually strange. He knew that he was the type of person who was usually excited to have achieved a breakthrough, but this time, he was very calm. At first, he hadn't felt any emotions at all. It must be the influence of the worldly Taoist, immortal imperator. With each moment that passed, he felt that excitement growing, until finally, he threw his head back and laughed uproariously. I'm an Archaean. You just wait, vile emperor. After I get back, I'll show you a thing or two. Off to the side, Bai Xiaochun stood there, blinking. Moments ago, the solemn figure standing in front of him had reminded him of his former master, and had filled his heart with reverence. However, that mood was instantly broken by Bai Xiaochun's laughter. At that point, Bai Xiaochun sighed. Still laughing, Bai Xiaochun sent his divine sense out to the fan face, summoning his 2 Archaean slaves. Now, it was much easier to summon and control them. Furthermore, they could exist outside of the treasured fan for much longer. In fact, he could sense that he now had the power and authority to take his Archaean slaves with him to the eternal immortal domains. Although they couldn't stay there for long, perhaps a few days at most, that was still a significant improvement. With 2 Archaean slaves at my side, who in the eternal immortal domains would dare to look at me the wrong way? He was so excited that he almost felt like jumping up and down. Sending some more divine sense out, he made contact with the boat in the fan face, and then waved his finger. Rumbling sounds then echoed out as the boat flew out of the fan and into the void, moving far faster than the fan ever could. At that point, Bai Xiaochun's eyes went wide. He could tell that, although the boat looked ordinary in nature, it was actually a sovereign-level precious treasure. With the 2 Archaean slaves on the boat, it would be dramatically fast, and also have incredible battle prowess. With this boat in my possession, and the fan as the core of my power, I am definitely a force to be reckoned with. Still bubbling with excitement, he turned his attention to the river in the fan face. Waving his hand, he attempted to summon it, only to find that nothing happened, except that a few waves rolled out across its surface. Bai Xiaochun cleared his throat. My lord, that river can only be used by someone with a sovereign cultivation base. Not willing to give in that easily, Bai Xiaochun tried over and over again, only to fail every time. However, he could already sense that, if he could summon that river, then if he had to fight the vile emperor again, he could easily kill him. A sovereign-level divine ability. Next, he looked over at the mountain that the Taoist Tower of Life and Death stood atop, but before he could even try to reach out and control it, Bai Xiaochun once again spoke up. It's the same with the mountain. Bai Xiaochun hesitated, then focused specifically on the tower. It's the same with the tower, Bai Xiaochun said quietly. Shut up, Bai Xiaochun snapped, glaring at him. His mood was already being ruined thanks to the spirit automaton. Snorting coldly, he put the boat away and then went back to the main surface of the fan. As he looked out at the ruins of the immortal world, he mused that if he encountered that old ghost woman again, he would probably be able to crush her. What happened next was even stranger. As soon as he thought about the old ghost woman, he suddenly felt his emotions stirring. All of a sudden, he realized that if she actually did show up, he would have the impulse to rush over and hug her. This is crazy. I can handle being less excited, and I can handle feeling like a relative of the mortal renegade. But why do I have feelings for that old ghost woman? Heavens, this won't do at all. He was so terrified that the blood drained from his face. The mere thought of what might happen if the old ghost woman showed up and he couldn't control himself caused him to tremble, and even break out in a sweat. Listen here, Mr. Worldly Taoist. Don't screw me over. I'm not you. By now, his excitement had completely vanished, and he actually felt a bit like crying. Scowling on the verge of tears, he sat down and sent the fan flying away, scanning the surrounding area for any signs of the old ghost woman. However, after flying along with the fan for only a short time, and before he could even leave the ruins of the immortal world, his expression flickered as he looked down at a certain area below. It wasn't the old ghost woman, but rather, something else that was now familiar. There in the ruins of the immortal world, he saw a valley filled with black clouds. The land surrounding that valley hadn't been damaged at all during the destruction of the world around it, and as such, looked exactly the same as when Bai Xiaochun had seen it in the worldly Taoist's memories. It was the same place where the mortal renegade had parted ways with his brother. The mortal renegade had changed dramatically because of that valley, and when he emerged, he began his quest to eradicate the starry sky. All of a sudden, Bai Xiaochun felt unprecedentedly serious. Looking at the clouds in the valley, he suddenly felt a profound sensation of danger. At the same time, memories that once belonged to the worldly Taoist stirred in his mind. He remembered that the worldly Taoist had thought of going into the valley to search for an explanation for why the mortal renegade had changed so much. At the time, he had already become a sovereign and yet, had been unable to find the valley. It was as if the valley had disappeared. No matter how the worldly Taoist searched, he couldn't find it. It was almost as if it had died. But now, years later, after all that remained of the immortal world was ruins, the valley appeared right in Bai Xiaochun's presence. Considering Bai Xiaochun's personality, it didn't matter that he was now an Archaean, he would never step into that valley. He would simply turn and leave. And yet, even as he looked away and prepared to send the fan away, his expression flickered. Then, he slowly walked off of the fan and headed toward the valley, his body seemingly not under his own control. At the same time, powerful emotions surged within him. The emotions turned into a tenacious focus, something that didn't belong to Bai Xiaochun. Instead, it came from the memories of the worldly Taoist, immortal imperator. It was like a form of madness that forced Bai Xiaochun to enter that valley, and search for the truths that the worldly Taoist had been unable to discover for himself in years past. Bai Xiaochun howled, his eyes turning bloodshot as he struggled against the effects. It was like there were two consciousnesses in his head, and the side controlled by the tenacious focus of the worldly Taoist was willing to do anything to unlock the secrets of the valley. Even as the struggle continued, Bai Xiaochun walked onward. After all, this was the will of a sovereign that he was contending with. To the worldly Taoist, the valley was simply too important. Soon, that will began to burn as if with fire, affecting Bai Xiaochun to the point where he shivered and stopped in place. After a few breaths of time passed, he looked up. In that moment, an aura erupted out of him that was very different from Bai Xiaochun's. The ruins of the immortal world began to quake, almost as if they wished to prostrate themselves to Bai Xiaochun. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun trembled and cried, "My lord!" Bai Xiaochun was trembling in unprecedented fashion. From the moment Bai Xiaochun had returned, he had been able to sense a familiar aura on him, which had grown even more intense throughout the process of rising to the Archaean realm. He had even started to respect Bai Xiaochun more because of it. But then Bai Xiaochun noticed what was happening, and intentionally changed his behavior, causing those feelings within Bai Xiaochun to fade. He had assumed that perhaps he was mistaken, and that it had all been some strange aspect of Bai Xiaochun's cultivation base. But now, as he looked at Bai Xiaochun standing in front of the Valley of Clouds, his heart began to pound. He was sure that he wouldn't make a mistake in this aspect. Although the person he was looking at was clearly not the worldly Taoist, immortal imperator, there was something about his aura that was causing even the void to tremble. It was something that Bai Xiaochun was sure that only his master could do. For Bai Xiaochun, everything disappeared, including the void, the ruins around him, and everything else. The only thing that remained was that figure standing there like a mountain. It was the same for the ruins of the immortal world. They were trembling as though something had awoken which had been dead since the most ancient of times. A soul had returned, born again, prompting everything and everyone to prostrate to the immortal imperator. Bai Xiaochun stood there quietly, unmoving, right in front of the valley of swirling black clouds. Eventually, he looked up, and in that moment, he seemed powerful and tall. He could shake heaven and earth, and cause the starry sky to tremble. His aura was one of matchless dignity and splendor, filled with unstoppable energy. Even as everything trembled, Bai Xiaochun slowly turned to look at Bai Xiaochun, who was still on the treasured fan. His facial features were those of Bai Xiaochun, but now, even someone who had only seen him a few times would realize that this was not Bai Xiaochun. There was something ancient in his eyes that Bai Xiaochun did not possess, as well as a profound grief. Right now, he seemed like a sovereign, the type of unique being who people would drop to their knees to worship as soon as they laid eyes on him. "Shao Kai," he said softly. Bai Xiaochun's jaw dropped, and he rushed forward. Dropping to his knees, he said, "My lord." Bai Xiaochun looked at Bai Xiaochun for a long moment, at the tears in his eyes, and at his excited expression. Then, Bai Xiaochun smiled. It was an emotional smile, filled with memories of primeval times. From the glint in his eyes, he was looking around at things that he hadn't been able to gaze upon for countless years. "Don't cry, Shao Kai," he said softly, reaching out to touzle the spirit automaton's head like an adult would a child's. More tears began to stream down Bai Xiaochun's face as he inched forward and threw his arms around Bai Xiaochun's leg, worried that if he didn't, his master would vanish. "You did well. You found a great successor for me." Although Bai Xiaochun's voice sounded as light and airy as it usually did, there was something profound and ancient to it, something that almost made him seem like an old man. "I don't exist anymore. The only thing left behind are my memories, and the focus within them. It won't last for long. And in fact, if I hadn't seen this valley of clouds, it would have faded away naturally in a few years." Bai Xiaochun turned to look back at the valley of black clouds, and the focus in his eyes grew clearer. "Shao Kai, wait here for your new master to return. From now on, please take good care of yourself. And be obedient." Even as Bai Xiaochun wept, Bai Xiaochun looked around at his old home, then turned and headed toward the valley. As he walked forward, his aura grew stronger and more powerful, causing more pressure to weigh down on the area. Soon, it seemed to surpass the Archaean level and approach that of a sovereign. As the last bit of will and focus from his memories burned away, he was given a very short window of time in which his energy could soar. If an Archaean were in the area, they wouldn't be able to endure such levels of force, and would instantly be killed in body and soul. As Bai Xiaochun stepped into the valley and made contact with the clouds, that temporary surge of energy caused everything to tremble. The roiling clouds seemed to contain terrifying powers of corrosion, and yet, they met their match when facing the will of a sovereign. As such, Bai Xiaochun was not harmed at all. He disappeared into the clouds, and Bai Xiaochun looked on, tears in his eyes, staring at the valley. Inside the clouds, Bai Xiaochun seemed completely calm and unflustered. Driven by tenacious focus, he slowly strode deeper and deeper into the valley. Everything was quiet, with nothing but roiling mist around him. Sometime later, as he reached the depths of the valley, an enormous shape appeared up ahead. Soon, it became completely visible. It was an enormous battleship. Upon catching sight of the ship, his eyes began to glitter brightly. He continued to walk, hurrying forward until he was able to see a dilapidated ship, stranded amidst sand and stone. It seemed to have been baptized by the passage of countless years. It was black, with tattered sails, and seemingly so old and ancient that it had surely existed far longer than the immortal world. Bai Xiaochun stopped in front of the dilapidated, ancient battleship, his eyes gleaming with understanding. Apparently, he had long since speculated about what mysteries were in this valley, and now, his speculations were being proved true. "So," he murmured, "the legends are true." He began to float up into the air, until he was at the same level as the prow of the ship, where he saw someone sitting there cross-legged, back to him. It was a corpse that had clearly been dead for countless years. The clothing draped on it was tattered by the passage of time, and it was also the origin of the misty clouds that filled the valley. The moment Bai Xiaochun caught sight of the corpse, he gasped sharply, and his eyes began to glitter brightly. Clearly, this corpse was incredibly old, even older than the ship itself. In fact, it was a sensation of ancientness that surpassed the entire starry sky. Despite being dead, this corpse's aura filled Bai Xiaochun with a sensation of boundless and majestic power that went beyond the level of a sovereign. The sensation of death, and the profound pressure, was so intense that it caused the sovereign aura around Bai Xiaochun to begin to crumble. At the same time, he heard the screams and howls of countless dying people. Face draining of blood, he forced himself closer toward the corpse, which was when he realized that despite being completely withered, there was a wound in its forehead. That wound was the true reason for the corpse's death. He had been killed with a single finger attack. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.